In 2017, the Referendum Council held a constitutional convention at Uluru, and the result was the Uluru Statement from the heart. There has been some criticism about this process, but today I'm going to talk about how the process was designed and how there is a very high chance that it will be accepted by the international community as a legitimate exercise of self-determination in a decolonial sense. Firstly, it's important to understand that the Uluru Statement belongs in a package of reform. The purpose of these reforms as a whole is to decolonise the British colonial territory of Australia. Decolonisation, as a political undoing of colonialism, is a very well established process in international law and politics. The nitty-gritty details as to what exactly needs to happen for a colony to decolonise has already been decided on. Since the 1960 Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, many former colonies have already decolonised. The main thing that needs to happen in decolonisation is that peoples who are under colonial domination need to freely determine a political status and also determine the political status of their territory. Various colonised peoples have freely determined their political status and decolonised their territories many times before. So if you put yourself in Australia's shoes and you want to design a process to railroad Aboriginal people in a certain direction of freely determining their status, firstly, you want to study decolonisation processes that have already happened. From studying previous processes, you will learn how high or low the bar can be set for what freely determined means. If you are in a group of people being chased by a bear, you don't have to be the fastest runner, you just don't want to be the slowest. Likewise, for Australia to run a process and get Aboriginal consent, that is, a level of consent that will be accepted by the international community as being legitimate, the process doesn't have to be the best process in the world. It just has to be better than the worst process that has already happened and was successful. Now, the worst decolonisation process in history is very possibly the West Papua Act of Free Choice. So let's look at this Act of Free Choice and then compare it to the Referendum Council process that resulted in the Uluru Statement from the heart. The Act of Free Choice was the process that decolonised West Papua. In this so-called Act of Free Choice, the people of West Papua chose to become part of Indonesia. Now, West Papua historically was kind of part of the Dutch East Indies. I say kind of because the coastal areas were part of the Sultanate of Tidore, and the Sultanate had treaties with the Dutch. But the highlands, the mountain areas, which is most of the land, were never under Dutch control. In 1949, the Dutch East Indies decolonised and became Indonesia. But there was some argument at the time whether West Papua should also be part of Indonesia or become its own country. The Dutch wanted to administer West Papua as a separate trust territory with the eventual goal to allow Papuan independence. The argument for this was that West Papua is very different to the rest of Indonesia. People of Papua have a completely different culture, religion, and different language, and they are a different race from Malay Indonesians. But Indonesia wanted West Papua to be integrated in with the rest of Indonesia. After many discussions in the United Nations and between the Netherlands and Indonesia, mind you, discussions not involving actual Papuans, a decision was made. The decision was outlined in the New York Agreement. The decision was that Indonesia would hold a process that would be overseen by the UN. So what happened was, the UN supervisors rocked up, sleeves all rolled up and ready to help Indonesia design a process for West Papuans, expecting to have a one-person, one-vote type referendum. But Indonesia had already designed a consultation process called Musyawarah. The Musyawarah consultation involved Indonesian officials hand-picking representatives for West Papua. The representatives were all Melanesian, all local Papuans, and came from 8 regional West Papuan councils and a handful of other hand-picked people. So in total, the Indonesians hand-picked about 1,022 representatives from a total Melanesian population of 800,000. Now this special process, like a deviation from a simple one person, one vote, was justified by Indonesia as being culturally appropriate because West Papuans were too primitive for democracy. There is evidence that most of these representatives were either bribed, blackmailed, and intimidated by Indonesian officials or the Indonesian military. The delegates in the end voted unanimously to integrate with Indonesia. Now, there are elements of this Musyawarah process that are very similar to the Referendum Council process, and I think this process was actually a template used by the Referendum Council. As I said before, the Referendum Council doesn't have to have the best process in the world in terms of making sure blackfellas have a fully informed choice, or that they all get a say in the process. All the Referendum Council needs to do is have a process that is better than Musyawarah. So it's a pretty low bar to meet. So let's look at the process that led to the Uluru Statement and how it is always just a little bit better than Musyawarah. And the perspective we will judge this is the perspective of the international community, as it is them who will ultimately judge if this process of decolonisation is legitimate or not. Firstly, the Referendum Council was initiated at the request of some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals in the Uluru Statement. So on the 6th of July 2015, a group of well-known Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had a meeting with the Prime Minister and the opposition leader in Kirribilli in Sydney, and they presented a statement asking for a process. Now, how do I say this as diplomatically as possible? But to say that many of the names listed on the bottom of that statement, I imagine, would induce eye-rolling from the grassroots community. But this list of names is not intended to make an impression on blackfellas. It is intended to make an impression on the international community. The names on that list ideally should be easy for someone overseas to Google those names and to verify that they're real people. These people were not chosen because they speak for community. So far, this process is a bit better than Musyawarah because the process looks like it was initiated by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and not by the New York Agreement, which was made by third parties. The Referendum Council held a series of regional dialogues across Australia. There were 12 regional dialogues in total, plus a meeting in Canberra. Each dialogue was capped at 100 participants. From those participants, some were chosen to go to the final convention at Uluru. Now, the proportional representation in this process is very similar to that of West Papuan process. Now, this is the back of an envelope calculation here, but the 13 dialogues, 100, each dialogue capped at 100, so that's 1,300 participants from an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population of about 800,000. So this is a slightly higher proportion of participants than from Indonesia's process. It's a little bit better. It is still very low though. It is still less than 1% of the population has had a say. Now the delegates, as they were called, were mostly handpicked by land councils. This is again a little bit better than the Indonesian process, where it was the government and the military who was handpicking participants. Aboriginal land councils, in case you're not familiar with them, are Aboriginal controlled and run, well, at least according to an outsider perception, which is what matters here. In Indonesia, they chose people from 8 different regions, while the Referendum Council had 12 regional dialogues. So yeah, that's a good thing to do, to try to get a geographical diversity. It's hard to compare side by side here though because of the different geographical sizes and population densities involved. At the regional dialogues, the Referendum Council gave the participants a crash course in constitutional law. Now, this course is kind of a joke. It's kind of a joke to expect the participants, who are mostly laymen, to get their heads around very technical and complicated issues in a few hours. But remember, it doesn't have to be good. It just has to be better than the West Papua process. So after the regional dialogues was the big meeting at the Uluru tourist township next to Uluru. There was a 3-day conference followed by the issue of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. During the conference, there was a walkout of delegates who were complaining about some aspects of the process, but the walkout didn't seem to have any real effect. The walkout group have been gaslit and minimised as a bunch of noisy troublemakers. Of course, as the Referendum Council trying to push through your own predetermined proposal, it's very difficult to have every single participant fall in line. Some are going to smell the rat and they're going to tell you about it. In that case, you can just chalk it down to a loud minority and the show goes on. There are some people going around saying that the final proposal put forward at Uluru was decided unanimously. Others describe it as a consensus. Now, the West Papua process was unanimous. I actually think unanimous sounds way more sus than a consensus. It sounds a bit like, like a North Korean election. Lydia Thorpe was one of the participants, and she said that she and others were subjected to tribal punishment for speaking out against the proposal during the convention at Uluru. She said that they were locked out of their hotel rooms and had to sleep out in the desert. Now, compare this to Musyawarah, where the allegations were against the Indonesian government and the Indonesian military, and they involved blackmail and threats of violence. The complaints from Lydia Thorpe, however, were from other Aboriginal people, not from the Referendum Council or from the Australian government. So from that international observer's perspective, it looks like, it's a process that has its up and downs, but it was still made by Aboriginal people without the Referendum Council or the Australian government interfering. If anything, this threat of tribal punishment might be seen as legitimising the process because it's showing that it happened under tribal law. Now, to summarise, the Referendum Council process is, as far as international precedent is concerned, it does meet the benchmark for acceptance. Now, that benchmark is pathetic, it's a joke, but the Referendum Council process, it meets that benchmark. Some of the criticism of the process are, for example, Michael Anderson has remarked how the process didn't meet any democratic standard. Well, Indonesia managed to worm their way out of using a democratic standard because they said they're dealing with so-called primitive people who can't vote. And that was accepted by the world. The world said nothing, so it still stood, even though it wasn't democratic. Lydia Thorpe has had complaints about threats, and others have talked about bribes being involved. But the West Papua process had all of that too, and the world said nothing. Others have complained that the process was invite only. Well, so was the West Papua process. Some can complain that maybe only a small number of people had a say, like less than 1% of the Aboriginal population. But almost the same proportion voted in West Papua. Now, we know the process is rigged, but it really doesn't matter, because the fact is that the process ticks those bare minimum boxes.